Hello students, today we'll be doing part 1 of my lecture on chapter 9, which deals with labor market discrimination. Chapter 9, labor market discrimination. And let me quickly lay out the different kinds of discriminations I will discuss today. And there are the following. We will start with employer discrimination. So this is the case when you have a racist firm, for instance. And then the second kind is employee discrimination. So this is the case when you have racist co-workers, correct? So for instance, you might have white racist co-workers who dislike working with black workers. Third kind of discrimination that we will discuss is called customer discrimination. And this is the case when you have a racist customer, let's say a racist white customer, who dislikes being served by a black employee, right? And then finally, we come to something called statistical discrimination. And statistical discrimination has nothing to do with prejudice. All right, so let's make that clear. So these are the four kinds of discrimination that we will discuss in class today. Now let me start by motivating a little bit of this. I'm going to replicate a table. It's in fact the very first table in the chapter 9. And I'm going to replicate a portion of this table. And this is the information we have. I'm going to, the information I'm going to present is annual earnings in thousands of dollars, right? And here are my categories of my demographic classes or categories of workers. Let me start with white workers. And under white you have male workers and female workers, right? Then we have black workers, and again, male black workers, female black workers. The next ethnic group that we will consider is Hispanics. Again, male, female. And then finally, Asian, male, female. Okay? And I'm going to have two rows here. In fact, I can set this up as a sort of a grid. All right. So here are the numbers. So we have, hang on just one more second. I need one more column here. And let me extend this just a little bit like this. All right. Okay. So the first row here is basically all workers. All workers. The next is only full-time workers. So the numbers are this for white males. Your average annual earnings in thousands of dollars is 67.7. Female white workers, 45.6 thousand. Right? Let's look at blacks. Male blacks, 50.5. Female blacks, 38.7. Hispanic males, 47.7. Hispanic females, 33.2. Asian males, 80.5. Asian females, 53.8. Correct? All right, now let's look at full-time workers. Okay, not all workers, just full-time workers. White males, 75.8. So you have a difference here between 67.7 and 75.8, and that's because when you consider all workers, you're considering part-time workers as well as full-time workers. And naturally, part-time workers earn less on an annual basis than full-time workers. All right, so full-time white females, 56.4. Right? For blacks, the numbers are 58.1 and 47. Hispanics, 53.1 and 41.1. Finally, for Asians, 88 and 64.4. Right? So what does this table tell us? Well, a couple of facts come out of this table, and let me quickly list them. The first, so stylized fact that is clearly evident here, is that in terms of annual earnings, you have the following ranking. Asians have the highest annual earnings, and they are followed by whites, who are followed by blacks, and blacks earn more on average than Hispanics. This may be something of interest to you. Second, if you look at the gender wage differences now, you find that within each group, what is true is that male earnings are higher than female earnings on average. Right? So let's dwell on the second observation just a little bit. And if you look at this gap here, the gap between 67.7 and 45.6, and as a percentage, you could calculate that as 67.7 minus 45.6 and express that as a percentage of the female white wage. And this number is 48%. So we have a 48% gender wage gap among whites when you consider all workers, correct? But however, if you focus on just full-time workers, you find that the gap is narrower. When you consider just full-time workers, and we perform a similar calculation, we arrive at the lower percentage wage gap of 34%. So in other words, the gender wage gap appears less among full-time workers than among all workers. Now, what might be behind this? Of course, what this suggests is that more female workers are part-time than male workers. So when you consider all workers, you have a larger wage gap in part because you're comparing, let's say, largely full-time male workers to, I mean, this is not true, but as an example, you're comparing largely full-time male workers to largely part-time female workers, let's say. Right? So that wouldn't be an apples to apples kind of comparison, correct? So when you account for full-time status, we find that, well, the gap exists. It remains, the gender wage gap remains, but it's a smaller gap, right? And here, the message here is that when you're comparing earnings across different demographic groups, you have to compare apples to apples. You follow me? So you must ideally control for such things as human capital. You must, right? You can't really compare a white college graduates with let's say black high school graduates. That would make no sense, right? All right. All right, let's now launch into the first of these four kinds of discrimination that I just mentioned, employer discrimination. So let's begin to discuss employer discrimination. Now here we will use a certain framework that was developed by a famous economist. He won the Nobel laureate. He's no more. He's passed on. His name was Gary Becker. Now, Gary Becker got his PhD at the University of Chicago in the 50s, and he is credited with, in a sense, revolutionizing economics. And before he came along, economics was not really applied to, all kinds of human problems. The focus of economics was more macroeconomics, let us say. But Gary Becker began to apply economics to such things as marriage, labor market discrimination, things of that nature, right? So Gary Becker's idea here is something called, and this is actually based on his doctoral dissertation, right? And he developed this idea called taste for discrimination. So the idea here is, in the context of employer discrimination, that you have racist employers, right? And this is what racism shows up as, right? So when you have a racist employer, let's consider, the two wages that, let's say whites and blacks. Let's say that we confine our focus to whites versus blacks. And let's say that we have the white wage. I'm going to call the white wage W with a sub W, and the black wage W with a sub B. Correct? And let us. So this is how Gary Becker viewed employer discrimination. When you have a racist employer, this employer finds it distasteful to hire black workers. So from the point of view of this employer, even though the dollar black wage is WB, what this employer does is that from the viewpoint of this employer, the wage of the black worker is not WB. It's actually bumped up a little from the point of view of this racist firm. It becomes WB times 1 plus D, right? Where D is some positive number, right? So of course what this does is this makes this product greater than the actual black wage. So the point is, because hiring a black worker is distasteful, from the point of view of the firm, the hourly wage of the black worker is actually not WB, but it's higher than WB, right? Now this D has a name, and it's called the discrimination coefficient. So this is called the discrimination coefficient. So the more racist the firm, the larger is this D. The larger is the discrimination coefficient. Correct? All right. Now let's make some further assumptions here to set up our theoretical sort of structure. And we are going to start by assuming that black and white workers are perfect substitutes. So in other words, there is no productivity difference between blacks and white workers. Let's begin by making that assumption. Right? So we can think of the production function of the firm. We can think of the production function of the firm is the following. Q, the output of the firm, is a function of the employment of white workers plus the employment of black workers. So what this sum is total labor. So what matters for the firm's output is total labor. The firm makes no distinction between white workers and black workers. All that matters to the firm is the total number of workers, right? So what we could do is, I suppose we could call this sum here simply E, right? So this is an implication of our assumption that black and white workers are perfect substitutes for each other, right? So this is an assumption we're going to make. Now, one implication of this is that when you think about the firm's isoquants, now this is again takes you back to, Econ 2302 perhaps, or the earlier part of our own course, right? What is an isoquant again? It's a line along which the firm's output is constant, correct? So let's say that along the horizontal axis we measure the employment of black workers, and along the vertical axis the employment of white workers, right? So the firm's isoquants are going to look like these lines, straight lines, because the two are perfect substitutes for each other, correct? And what are the slopes going to be? The slopes are, since they are exactly one-to-one substitutable for each other, the slopes are -1. Right, so these are straight line isoquants. Now you may or may not remember that when isoquants are linear like this, you end up with so-called corner solutions. Traditionally, the firm chooses a combination of the two inputs, the input measured along the x-axis and the input measured along the y-axis. The firm chooses the optimal combination of these two, where an isoquant, or rather where an isocost is tangent to an isoquant, correct? But in our case, the isoquant is a straight line as well. Now, isocosts, we know, are straight lines. They are like the consumer's budget line, correct? So in this case, since the isoquant, so ordinarily, so let me show you what this would be like usually when we think about the theory of production, right? You have labor, typically we measure labor along the x-axis and capital along the y-axis. In our case, we have two kinds of labor, black labor and white labor. But traditionally, we have labor and capital, right? And these are our typical convex isoquants, correct? And the isocost is a straight line, like this, correct? And the slope of this straight line is basically the ratio of the wage rate, the cost of labor, the price of labor, to the rental rate of capital, right? So what combination of labor and capital would the firm choose to, let's say, produce an output level Q0, which corresponds to the innermost of these three isoquants that I've drawn? Well, that's going to be where the isocost is tangent to the isoquant. Is that correct? But since, in our case, the isoquants themselves are straight lines, we are going to end up with corner solutions. So either the firm will use only white workers or only black workers, right? That's what's going to happen. So, for instance, if your isocost is less steep, right? So if our isocosts are, for instance, like this, where would be the cheapest way to produce, let's say, this level of output here that corresponds to Q0, this innermost isoquant? Well, you can see that it'll be cheapest right here. That'll be the lowest isocost. So it'll be cheapest to produce output Q0 by using only black workers. You follow me? So building on this then, we can have the following sort of conditions for whether the firm is going to employ white workers or black workers. Right? And the condition is quite simply the following. Firm will employ only white workers if the cost of a black worker, which is from the point of view of the firm, it's not just WB, remember, it's WB times 1 plus the coefficient of discrimination, correct? Or the discrimination coefficient. So this is the cost of a black worker, the wage that must be paid the black worker. So the firm will employ only white workers if this is bigger than the white wage, the wage of white workers. So if this is the case, black workers are more expensive from the point of view of the racist firm, and so the firm will employ only white workers. On the other hand, the firm will employ only black workers if the opposite is true, if black workers are cheaper than white workers. Correct? So one implication then of this setup is that you're going to have a segregated labor market or a segregated workplace. In other words, you're going to have some firms that only hire black workers, right? And which firms will these be? These will be this category of firm, correct? On the other hand, there will be other firms that hire only white workers. And which firms are those? Those are firms that fall into this category, correct? So these, the latter, the firms that employ only white workers, may have a higher D, which kind of pushes up their perceived cost of hiring a black worker. Right? So the more racist firm, the firm with a higher discrimination coefficient, would perceive the black wage as being higher, much higher than what it really is, correct? And so they might think of the black wage as being higher than the white wage, and therefore hire only white workers. Right? Now, one point that comes out of this analysis is that it is expensive for the firm it is expensive for the firm to discriminate. So these are some of the implications of our setup here. So the first implication is that you have a segregated workplace. So you have either black firms that only hire black workers, versus firms that only hire white workers. You don't have a mixed race workplace, correct? Given our assumptions. Now let's come to the second implication, and that is that it is expensive for the firm to discriminate. So let us assume, let me assume here that the black wage, WB, is less than the white wage. And why this is, we will discuss a bit later, right? Why this is something we'll discuss a bit later. But let's assume, to begin with, that black workers, their wage, without adding the discrimination coefficient, without adding racism to the picture. From the point of view of a non-racist firm, WB is less than WW. The black wage is less than the white wage. Right? Let's make that assumption. Right? Now let's consider a colorblind, meaning non-racist firm. So this is a firm that has what value of D? D is equal to 0. Right? So if D is equal to 0, given that WB is less than WW, this firm will only hire black workers because they are cheaper. Remember, there is no productivity difference between black and white workers. We've assumed to begin with that the two workers are perfect substitutes for each other in production. Right? The firm will hire only black workers. Right? How many workers will the firm hire? How many workers will the firm hire? Now this can be answered using what we learned in the chapter on labor demand. Right? So what was that condition for profit maximization? The condition was that the wage, the condition we had was that the wage be equal to the value of the marginal product of labor, correct? So the condition for profit maximization is that W, or in this case WB, because only black workers are being hired by this colorblind firm, be equal to the value of the marginal product of labor. Correct? So let me draw a little diagram here to show you what I mean. And this is a diagram that you've seen earlier on in this course. So what you're measuring along the horizontal axis is the quantity of labor or employment, right? And what does the VMPL curve look like? It is negatively sloped like this, correct? And that's because the marginal product of labor decreases as the firm employs more and more labor, right? You have the law of diminishing returns to labor. So this is the VMPL curve. Let me label it. Right? Now let's say that the black wage is here. So this is WB. So at that wage, actually, hang on. Yeah, well, that's fine. At that wage, how many? Let me make that line a solid line like this. How many workers will this firm hire? So many workers, correct? So the employment is going to be, I'm going to call it E star. Correct? So this is what we've learned from the chapter on labor demand, right? Now in this case, what is going to be the firm's producer surplus? And again, this is something we've learned earlier on in this course. And the producer surplus is, if you recall, this yellow shaded area, correct? Why is it that yellow shaded area? Again, I'm just recapping stuff from earlier on in this course, right? So one thing that you will know is that if this is the VMPL curve, the value of output when the firm employs E star workers, the value of output is simply the area under the entire curve. So this shaded area that I've drawn, this trapezoid, represents the value of output produced by those E star workers. Correct? So this is, you can think of this as the firm's total revenue from sales, from producing output. And then the firm has to pay the workers, correct? And how much has to be paid workers? Well, the payment to workers is essentially that orange rectangle, the area of that orange rectangle, right? Each worker has to be paid W sub B. And how many workers are employed? E star workers. So multiply W sub B and E star, and you end up with that orange rectangle, correct? So if you take the firm's total revenue, which is the trapezoid, and subtract the orange rectangle, you're left with the yellow triangle, correct? So that is the firm's producer surplus. Producer surplus. And while producer surplus is not quite profit, you can think of it as akin to profit. It's not quite profit because we haven't taken into account the firm's other costs, the cost of capital, for instance, correct? So it's not quite profit, it's akin to profit. Right? So this is the case of a colorblind, non-racist firm, hires only black workers, produces surplus equal to that, or the yellow area. Right? Now let's consider a slightly racist firm. Correct? So let's consider a slightly racist firm. So what's a slightly racist firm? A slightly racist firm would be a firm that has a value, has a positive D, discrimination coefficient, but the D is small. It's positive but small. Correct? So if you have a slightly racist firm, so this is a firm with a small d, right? A d that is so small that this condition holds. Which condition? The lower one here. This condition holds. So it's a small enough d that the perceived wage of black workers is less than the wage of white workers. Right? So this means that the slightly racist firm hires only black workers because they are, from its point of view, cheaper, even though there is a little racism involved, right? So now, in this diagram that we've drawn here, the firm is going to consider the wage of the black workers that it is hiring to be not WB, but higher. Why higher? Because it's not going to be WB, it's going to be rather this higher amount. And what is that higher amount? It's WB times 1 plus D. Is that correct? And that, of course, is greater than WB. Right? So this is going to be the perceived wage. So with that perceived wage, how many workers does the firm hire? The firm now hires a smaller number of workers. So let's call this E1. Correct? Now with this lower level of employment, and this is lower than the number of workers that a colorblind firm would hire, correct? And what happens to produce a surplus of this slightly racist firm? Is it still the yellow triangle that you see? Well, no, it's not going to be that yellow triangle. And you can see this quite clearly. The producer surplus of this firm is going to be this green triangle. Correct? So you can see here that racism has cost the firm a little bit of producer surplus. This is what I mean by it is expensive for the firm to discriminate. And you can push this story even further. Now consider a firm that is highly racist. Right? Now if the firm is highly racist with a very high D, then the following condition might kick in. This may now be true. Correct? In other words, WB times 1 plus D is now bigger than W sub W. Black workers are now perceived to be more expensive than white workers. So the firm hires only white workers. Now do remember that we started by assuming this, correct? That white workers were more expensive than black workers. So let's say that the white wage is up here. So let's say the white wage is up here. So that is the white wage, and at that higher white wage, the highly racist firm employs this number of white workers, let's call that E2, right? So the highly racist firm hires fewer workers, only white workers of course, but fewer workers than the colorblind firm or the slightly racist firm, right? Hires fewer workers, and now what's the producer surplus of the highly racist firm? It is in fact this red shaded triangle on top. Correct? So it earns even less producer surplus than the slightly racist firm. Right? So being racist is expensive for the firm. it is expensive to discriminate. Right? So that's something that comes out of this analysis. Right? Now let's go and explain this. So let us find an explanation of this. So that takes us to our next page. So this is the structure we are going to have, right? And the subtopic here is labor market equilibrium in this story. So labor market equilibrium. Right, so I'm going to draw the following diagram. Right, and what I will measure along the horizontal axis is the number of black workers. Right, so EB, which is basically the number of black workers, lost my cursor, just hang on a second. Just hold on a second, I seem to have lost my cursor. Let me just unscrew it and screw it back on. There we go. Right, now on the vertical axis, what we measure is the black to white wage ratio. So what's being measured along the vertical axis is not the black wage, but rather the black wage divided by the white wage. Correct? Now in this vertical axis, I'm going to mark off 1. So what does that 1 indicate? That's when you have equality between the black wage and the white wage. Correct? Now let's begin by assuming that all firms are racist. Some are more racist than others, but there exists no colorblind firm. Let's assume that, right? So let's assume there are no colorblind firms. Right? So no colorblind firms. So in that case, if the black wage was equal to the white wage, would any black workers be hired? Well, the answer must be no, because since every firm is slightly racist, every firm is going to have a positive D, right? So even though WB is equal to WW at WB by WW equals 1, what's going to happen, the implication is going to be that WB multiplied by 1 plus D shall be higher than WW. Right? So because of racism thrown into the story, because of this positive coefficient of discrimination, black workers will be perceived as more expensive than white workers. So therefore, if the black wage and the white wage were identical, no black workers would be hired. Correct? So now let's start to lower this ratio of black to white wage. Let's start lowering it. Right? You see that those two downward arrowheads? So a time will come now when it becomes worthwhile for the least racist firm to now start to employ black workers. You see, so what we're doing here is we're taking this WB and we're reducing it. And we keep reducing it until for the least racist firm, the following becomes true. What becomes true? The black wage times 1 plus D is now less than the white wage. That becomes true. For whom? For which firm? We're not talking about all firms. This is for the least racist firm, the firm with the smallest d out there. Correct? And so at this point on, black workers start to be hired. Correct? So, and as the black wage falls further relative to the white wage, more and more firms start hiring black workers. Correct? So you end up with this kind of a demand curve for black workers. You follow me? So the lower is the relative wage of black workers to white workers, the greater the quantity demanded of black workers. Correct? So as this drops, more and more firms become willing to hire black workers. This starts with the least racist of firms, but then it percolates down to firms that are more and more racist. Correct? So this is the demand curve for black workers. Demand curve for black workers. Right? Now into this story we need to throw in a supply curve of black workers, and to keep things simple, let's assume that the supply of black workers is constant at any point in time. So this will give us a vertical supply curve of black workers. So this is the supply curve of black workers, right? And so where do we have labor market equilibrium? We have equilibrium where, of course, where the two curves intersect, correct? And this brings us to that point, and that then gives us the equilibrium ratio of the two wages, the equilibrium ratio of the two wages, and you can see quite clearly that equilibrium WB by WW, the ratio, is much less than 1, right? Because where is 1 in the story? 1 is up here, right? So our equilibrium relative wage is much less than 1. This implies, of course, that the equilibrium black wage is less than the equilibrium white wage. You have a racial wage gap. So this explains exactly why we may have a world in which blacks are paid less than whites. Correct? All right. The next kind of discrimination that I will talk about is employee discrimination. So this is the next kind of discrimination I'm going to talk about. It's called employee discrimination. So this is a case where you have a racist white worker who finds it distasteful to work alongside black workers. Right? So this means that if the wage being paid the white worker is WW, what this worker does, this white worker, views the wage as less. You follow me? So this D there is now the discrimination coefficient of this racist white worker who doesn't like to work alongside black workers. So if you make him work alongside black workers, he's going to view his wage as less than what it really is. What is being paid is that in dollars, but he views it as less. He discounts it, right, by multiplying it by number 1 minus D, where D is a positive number that is, of course, less than 1, right? So D is a positive number less than 1. So this is the framework we have here. This captures the racist workers' taste for discrimination, according to Gary Becker. So again, we're going to stick with our assumption. We're going to stick with our assumption that the two kinds of workers, blacks and whites, are perfect substitutes for each other. So there are no productivity differences, right? So we're going to continue to assume that there are no productivity differences between workers, okay? And we're going to also stick to our assumption that, we're going to, in this case, since we're talking about employee discrimination, we're going to abstract from employer discrimination, right? So in this particular story, there are no racist employers, right? Because the focus here is on racist co-workers, correct? So we're going to assume that there are no productivity differences. So no productivity differences. Right. Having slight trouble with my pen. Just give me a second here. So no productivity differences between blacks and white workers. And we're going to assume that there are no racist firms. So the idea here is that we're going to focus on racism among co-workers, right? So what are the two sort of logical implications of this structure? First implication of this structure is that employers will never hire white and black workers. So there will never be a mixed race workplace. And why is that? Because the firm knows that since the white worker finds it distasteful to work with alongside black workers, right? The firm is going to have to compensate the white worker to work alongside black workers, right? Because the white worker, remember, discounts his wage. If he's being paid $20 an hour, from his point of view, he's being paid only like 17 or 18 because he has this positive discrimination coefficient, correct? So in order to induce him to work, the firm will have to pay the white worker a higher wage to compensate him, right? So, in other words, white workers will have to be paid a compensating wage differential, right? So white workers will need to be paid more. And this, of course, is something that firms won't want to do, because when you pay the white worker more, it cuts into the firm's profits, right? So the firm would prefer to have a segregated workplace, right? No point hiring white workers to work alongside black workers, because that means you'll have to compensate the white worker for this trouble you're heaping on him. You follow me? And this is expensive for the firm. So it's cheaper than to keep the two groups separate, right? Remember, the two groups are equally productive, correct? So the employers will never hire white workers and black workers, right? Not white and black. It'll be either all white or all black, right? So in this setup here with employee discrimination, we again end up with a segregated workplace. Remember, the segregated workplace was the implication of employer discrimination also. So this is something that holds true even with employee discrimination, right? However, this kind of discrimination does not give rise to a racial wage gap, right? So unlike employer discrimination, which gave us in the end an equilibrium relative wage of black to white workers less than 1, right? In this story here, we will never get this. We will always have WB being equal to WW. Why is that? What's the logic for this? Let's say that in the beginning, WB was less than WW. Let's say black workers were cheaper in the beginning. Now, since there is no productivity difference between the two kinds of workers, and remember, the firm is not racist in our story, correct? So the firm is not racist and the two workers are identical productivity-wise. If black workers are cheaper than white workers, all firms will only want to hire black workers, correct? So firms will hire black workers and keep demanding black workers, and this will cause the black wage to be bidded up by firms. You follow me? If firms pursue only black workers, this is going to drive up the wage of black workers until the black and the white wage are equal. You get my story? So even if black wages were lower than white wages to begin with, competitive pressures will ensure that in the end, the black wage and the white wage are the same. So with employee discrimination, we do not have a racial wage gap, correct? Now in real life, of course, as I showed you right at the beginning of this lecture, we do have an earnings gap between whites and blacks, correct? So the point here is that this earnings gap cannot be explained solely on the basis of employee discrimination. That's the point, correct? The third implication, of course, is there is no cost to the firm. Right? We learned that employer discrimination was actually expensive for the firm in the form of lost producer surplus, but there is no cost to the firm. Why is there no cost to the firm of employee discrimination? And that's because in the end, the two wages, the wages of black workers and white workers, are going to be the same, correct? So with identical wages, well, every firm is going to hire how many workers? Either black or white. Of course, there's no mixing in this case, remember? But the point is that every firm is going to be hiring exactly the number of workers that maximizes profits, and you're going to have this common W. So let's call this WB equals WW equals just plain W, a common W, correct? So at that common W, how many workers is each firm going to hire? So many, E star. And so what's going to be the producer surplus of all firms? This shaded triangle, correct? So there is no cost to the firm in this case. All firms are identical, and they're all maximizing profits. And so there is no profit loss to the firm from the existence of racist white workers who do not like working with black workers. Right? So this is employee discrimination. Next we go to customer discrimination. Right, so what is the story here? Customer discrimination. So this is the case when you have white customers who don't like being served by black employees, right? So the taste for discrimination in this case would show up like this. If P is the price of the product, if P is the price of that is being charged the customer views this price as higher, right, if the white customer is being served by a black employee, right? So the perceived price of the product now rises in the eyes of the racist customer, right? So how does a firm tackle this? Now, firms can tackle this in the following way. The firm could ensure that there is no contact between black workers and white customers. So let's say the firm could make its entire sales force white, right? So keep black workers in the home office, in the back office, and the white workers up in front dealing with customers, correct? So all these so-called contact jobs, and what are contact jobs? These are jobs that involve contact with customers. So contact jobs go to white workers. So this is one way a firm could deal with customer racism, correct? But on the other hand, not all firms can do this, correct? It may not be easy for all firms to segregate workers like this. So in firms where it is impossible to prevent the black worker from interacting with white customers, the following is going to happen. The firm, to retain the customer, will have to charge the customer a lower price. So the firm, in a sense, has to bribe the customer by giving the customer a discount on the price. because otherwise the customer may not buy. Why? Because from the point of view of the customer, because of this positive discrimination coefficient, the price is higher than the actual sticker price of the item. Correct? So in order to lure the customer in, to make the customer buy the product, the firm will have to offer a price discount. And of course, this price discount is going to cost the firm some profit. Right? So now the black worker will have to compensate the employer for the loss of profit. Correct? So this is going to lead to, as I said, lower profits, and this is going to essentially then lead to the black wage falling. Black workers are going to have to take a pay cut to compensate the firm for the lower profit. Again, why is the firm suffering a lower profit? Because it is having to bribe the racist customer by giving the customer a price discount. Correct? So with customer discrimination, you do end up with a black-white wage gap. Correct? So we end up with a racial wage gap. Right? So remember that with employee discrimination, we do not have a racial wage gap. Right? But with customer discrimination, we do. Correct? Our next and last kind of discrimination is called statistical discrimination. And statistical discrimination has nothing to do with racism. Let me give you an example of statistical discrimination. So this is discrimination when a firm treats a group differently based on the demographic characteristics of that group. Right? Now this is perfectly legitimate in many cases. Consider insurance companies. Right? If you're trying to buy car insurance, right? We all know that male teenagers have to pay higher premiums than female teenagers. Right? So you might think that the car insurance company is discriminating against male teenagers. But this is perfectly legitimate. Why? Because long experience has taught the insurance company that male teenage drivers are more reckless than female teenage drivers. This comes out of the data. Correct? So this is what statistical discrimination is about. So the idea here is that the firm does not have complete information from the employee's resume. Right? The firm does not have complete information about the employee's productivity based on the resume. The resume does not provide perfect information. Right? So we know this this worker got a bachelor's degree. Correct? But that bachelor's degree is an imperfect signal of the worker's true productivity. So the firm doesn't quite know how much to pay the worker based only on the resume. Right? So in our simple story here, let's assume that all workers have to take a test. Right? And they get a test score. The firm basically administers a test to all applicants, all job applicants. Right? And the test score that each worker gets is some T. And of course, there's variation across workers in this T. Right? And let's say this T, in the case where the test score is a perfect measure of productivity, let's say that this T exactly measures productivity. In which case, what wage would be offered this worker? The wage offered will be simply equal to T. Right? So this is the case where the test score is a perfect measure of productivity. Correct? But what if the score is an imperfect measure of productivity? If the score is an imperfect measure of productivity, the wage offered the worker may in fact be a weighted average of the score itself and the average score of all workers from the worker's own group, demographic group, who have taken the test before. Follow me? Let's call that number T over bar. So this is the mean test score of all the workers in the firm experience from this current workers demographic group who have taken this test in the past, right? So we're going to, you see this? So this is a weighted average. Alpha is the weight. So alpha is a number that's bigger than 0, less than 1, right? So this is a weighted mean of two values. What two values? The worker's own test score and the average test score of all the workers from the worker's own demographic group who have taken this test in the past. Correct? Now, the better the test score is as a measure of productivity, right? The better the test score is as a measure of productivity. In other words, the less the uncertainty. The less the uncertainty, the bigger is alpha, right? So when alpha equals 1, this would imply that the test score is a perfect measure of productivity. So what is this? Can this framework give rise to a racial wage gap? Right? And it might, right? Because now the white wage would be like this. It would be alpha times the test score of this white worker plus 1 minus alpha times the average score of all white workers. Correct? And what's the black wage, the wage offered the black worker? This would be alpha times the test score of the black worker plus 1 minus alpha times the average test score of all black workers who have previously taken this test. Right? Now let's say that the two workers, the black worker and the white worker, have identical scores. Right? They have identical scores. However, WB would be less than WW if the average score of all black workers in the past has been less than the average test score of all white workers. Right? In other words, this particular black worker is being penalized for the low test scores of other black workers in the past. So this is statistical discrimination. So why does a firm employ statistical discrimination? Not out of racism, but because what the firm observes of the worker from the worker's resume, test score, etc. Right? From what the firm observes, the firm doesn't have a clear idea of how productive the worker is. Right? The signals that the worker is offering the firm are imperfect signals of productivity. And so the firm has to, in that case, perhaps statistically discriminate. Right? The firm tries to fill in the blanks by looking at the demographic characteristics of the worker. Right? And with that, I'm going to end part 1 of my lecture, and I will record part 2 perhaps tomorrow and post it later.